good luck. Give my cat a treat for peace and quiet. And let's get started. First, I'd like to thank everyone who's here, all the people who are watching. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion. It's going to be about our city's route to recovery and the way public transit plays a role on our road back to normal. My name is Victor Tence. I'm a student reporter, and I guess very recently I learned that it's respectful to start these meetings with an acknowledgement that the neighborhood I'm currently at sits on an ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of San Francisco. That's my first land acknowledgement, so hopefully I did that correctly. I would also like to say thank you to the City College of San Francisco's journalism department, as well as the Democracy and Informed Citizen Emerging Journalist Fellowship Initiative. It's a project of California Humanities. I'm a participating fellow, and this panel is part of said project. And of course, a thank you to all the panelists who have made time to be here today and talk with us. For everyone watching, we will have time for Q&A with our panelists at the end of the discussion. You can submit questions you have in the Q&A chat. It should be around the bottom of the screen. So we are fortunate enough to have three panelists here with us to discuss the impact COVID-19 has had on our public transportation, our transit operators, and city residents. Also, we'll talk about the current state of Muni and its future. So let's meet them. I'll begin with Mark Cords. He's the executive director of the San Francisco Transit Riders. It's an organization that has been fighting for an excellent, affordable, and growing public transit system. Cords himself is passionate about equity and access for all, and is taking on the challenge of fighting for transit riders across San Francisco. And next up, we have Carly Graf. She's a San Francisco-based journalist with experience writing about politics, institutional inequity, and social justice. She's currently a reporter at the SF Examiner, where she covers all things transportation and transit equity. And finally, we have Roger Marenco. He's president of the Transport Workers Union of America Local 250A. He's a former transit operator himself, so Marenco now leads a union who represents several collective bargaining units in San Francisco, including Muni operators and transit fare inspectors. I'd like to thank all of you guys for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. So to open things up and to start it off, I'd like to talk about, well, what changed the most since last year, or to put it another way, what aspect of our public transportation was hit hardest when everything shut down last year as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Can I start with you, Carly?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the most obvious, or at least the most visible of those impacts would be the fact that Muni Metro was totally shut down. That was the first thing to go, and it hasn't really come back in any meaningful sense, save for an attempted restart in August that did not go as planned, to say the least. So, you know, right then you basically had transit patterns mirroring the lack of downtown commute. So we had no underground subway, we had no trains running to what was once the center of the city, where so much of our activity was based. But then, of course, you know, buses were also cut pretty significantly. At the start of the pandemic, that went down to 40% of pre-pandemic service levels, with a focus on maintaining a network that SFMTA felt would best serve transit-dependent riders and essential workers. So I think just high level, the biggest impact has been the sheer amount of service that is offered to San Francisco residents. And as I'm sure we'll get into later, it is going to take quite a while for that to come back in full. But I think that that's probably what many folks are experiencing in their day-to-day, is just fewer options, and you know, a lack of trains and buses running either further away from them or at less frequency if they are fortunate enough to live near a line that's continued.
Roger, would you like to chime in with that on that question?
Can you repeat the question, please, Victor?
In your view, how was our public transit system changed the most by last year's shutdown?
I would have to agree with what was previously stated in terms of the subway shutting down. The lack of vehicles out on the road, the LRVs, which are the light rail vehicles, was absolutely detrimental because, as many people know here in the city and county of San Francisco, the train system is probably the baby of Muni, of the SFMTA. That is the pride and joy of the public transportation system here in terms of making the system flow as steadily as possible. So when the subway was shut down, that meant hundreds of trains were out of service. That meant tens of thousands of people, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people were left without a ride to get to work, school, church, shopping, the doctor's office, wherever it was that they were going to. So that right there had an absolutely detrimental effect on the city and county of San Francisco. And it's interesting because nowadays, you know, as public transportation is slowly coming back, the general public is sort of realizing just absolutely how imperative, important the transit operators are in terms of providing that service. And one of the things that I read today in an article that was written by actually Graf, which is a great article, by the way. If you haven't read it, please read it. One of the simplest things that you can possibly do as a rider of public transportation is just say thank you to the operator for providing the service and getting you from point A to point B in a safe, timely manner. So if you haven't read that article, please check it out.
Thank you. And Mark, I'd like to hear what you have to say on this.
Yeah, so I guess I would just try to add a little bit to what Carly and Roger have sort of laid out. First, I think we owe a huge thank you to the members of Rogers Union for their service during COVID. You know, it seems like 1,000 years ago now, but those early days, we didn't know how it was transmitted. We didn't know how it was caught. People were afraid of, you know, all kinds of things, and those folks were driving those vehicles on those limited routes, trying to get essential workers in the transit dependent places, you know, at a sort of indeterminate risk. And I think we too quickly dismiss that initial set of insecurity, the way in which we all sort of, you know, kind of hunkered down and then looked out at the world to the extent that we had the privilege of doing that. But those citizens, those riders, those essential staff folks across our city, and, you know, the people that provide our transit services were hugely impacted by the shutdown. I think also, you know, folks within that infrastructure, a lot of them aren't doing the jobs that they were doing before. You know, there's a whole car and bus cleaning crew that's in the backdrop, really working hard to kind of maintain a level of safety across the network, and trying to do that work. But that's not what they were hired to do. They were hired to be, you know, fare inspectors or PCOs or you know, run our trolley system or cable cars. I mean, it's been incredibly disruptive, and that disruption hit the agency hard, I think, and the agency has really tried to provide service as best it could in that. And I think just kind of, if we can, as hard as it is, turn our minds back to those early days, it's an important place to start. I think I would add a couple of other things. You know, the change to ridership patterns, which Carly alluded to, just no more sort of rush hour commute downtown as a key job center, but the way in which our more neighborhood focused trips, our cross-town trips, the travel for essential workers to places like hospitals and city offices, that evolving network of kind of what our transit system needed to serve, I think they did their best to try, or they tried very hard, I should say, to sort of adapt an existing system to serve new needs. And again, I think that points to sort of an attempt at being resilient, an attempt at being adaptive, but really focusing on those sort of key things that we needed to get people to. And that shift, I think, is something we want to both applaud and then ask how we can carry it forward. And the last thing I would want to mention is just, you know, this sort of ongoing providing of transit in social distancing, in a social distancing way. You know, how many people is safe on a vehicle? And what does that do to vehicle capacity? And how many vehicles does it take to serve a route then if you can only carry, you know, a third of its total capacity or 25%? And that challenge both kind of throughout the year and now as we're looking towards recovery, around keeping folks safe, abiding by the guidelines that we're receiving, but also struggling then with that limited capacity to provide service kind of from behind the demand curve, I think is another place where there's been a lot of tensions and struggles. And it's worth keeping in mind, this is it's an infrastructure organization that serves people. And that's I think a critical nexus to sort of focus on as we move forward.
Okay. So before we continue the conversation, let's go back a little to just before COVID changed everything. So about late 2019, basically talking about the pre-existing conditions that Muni was struggling with before the shutdowns. And back then, the headlines were primarily focused on a transit operator shortage. So I wanted to ask, what does an operator shortage back then and now, what does that mean for transit riders? And how does that issue continue to impact us? I'm going to kick this off first to Roger.
So I would rephrase that and not say that there is an operator shortage. What I would say is that there is a shortage of vehicles. We have the operator, we have the men and women ready to go, ready to operate these vehicles. But as you guys already know, the cable cars are out of service. The PCCs are out of service. Those are the historic streetcars, the F trains, and the LRVs are out of service. So what we have a shortage of is vehicles because they're parked at the bus yards, at the bus station, at the train stations, excuse me. And what we have, like Mark stated earlier, is we have a whole bunch of operators doing other duties, whether they are assisting with providing personal protective equipment, whether they are cleaning buses, whether they are holding stop signs at a specific location, whether they are detailing buses or whatever it is the case that they are doing, assisting with COVID-19 vaccine sites, etc. We have the operators, we have the men and women ready to go, ready to operate the vehicles. What we don't have is the actual vehicles in service. So there is a shortage of vehicles. Interestingly enough, they're there. The vehicles are there. The problem is they're just parked, not doing anything. They're just sitting there. So we have the men and women, we have the operators ready to go, ready to provide the service. But the vehicles are parked in the damn parking lots. They're parked at the train stations. They're not going out, they're not moving. So we don't have a shortage of operators at this moment. What we have is a shortage of equipment, vehicles, because they are sitting at the train stations parked.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, Carly.
Sure. So I think to get to Roger's point, there's sort of an interesting, in the present moment, there's kind of a tension happening where I think people are eager and ready to go back to work. But as Mark was saying earlier, there is not a whole lot of certainty around what that's going to mean looking ahead in terms of how much service can be provided, at what frequency, what travel patterns are going to be like when they're going to return. So in the present moment, there are a lot of operators that have been asked to do other jobs, and they have done so incredibly well, and with a great amount of commitment to that difficult task. But the agency is saying, we don't really know what this is going to look like moving forward, so we need to kind of slowly roll service out. Prior to the pandemic, there was my predecessor actually revealed that there was some internal strife over essentially how to deal with the fact that there were going to be some changes, some pretty significant changes coming to Muni, and if they, in terms of service provision, and if they hadn't been addressed, or if they were not addressed, we were going to find ourselves in a situation where the agency had not prepared and trained enough operators, had not incentivized enough operators in terms of, sufficient pay, sufficient training in order to be able to meet those service needs. And that all came to a head. And so you saw late 2018, early 2019, really, really awful delays and a lot of time passing between buses and trains. That was no fault of the operators. It was because the agency had basically failed to heed some warnings internally, or failed to figure out how to address that tension that it had predicted. So this difficulty, or this tension over how to match our incredibly valuable resources in terms of labor and transit operators with the kind of service that's being provided did predate the pandemic. When the pandemic started, there was a hiring freeze, but has since been exacerbated. And so to Roger's point, while there are folks that are really ready and eager to get back to work, the agency has said at least that there is some difficulty around figuring out how to best match operators with service moving forward, especially given the fact that we have not hired that many folks, if any, during the pandemic, other than what they've been calling mission critical positions, which again is a term that's up for debate because I would argue that all muni operators are mission critical, but the agency has had to figure out some ways to kind of stratify who it's going to hire when, given limited resources and uncertainty around the future.
Thank you. And any thoughts on this, Mark?
So I want to be clear, I'm not a transit worker and I'm not in transit management. I'm a transit advocate. And I think there's a lot of people who would love to be on transit in San Francisco who would love to have better service. And I think that solution is, yes, let's get the existing equipment and operators back out on the streets and servicing our community. But let's also recognize that, to achieve our long-term climate goals, to really achieve some things that we as a city have named as important, hiring additional operators and providing additional services is part of that puzzle. And our view, sort of from the advocacy perspective, is the sooner we get started doing that, the better. There are certainly technical things that SFMTA has pointed to: the need to elevate more supervisors, the need to train more certain tiers of operators, and this creating openings in one space as you sort of do another. This would be something Roger's going to know far more about than I am. I would just simply defer to, from my view, I would love to not have to use my car to get around the city, but actually like to be able to use public transportation. And the level of service that was provided in 18, 19, 20, that's projected for 21 and projected even for 22 probably wouldn't quite get me there. And to make that real shift to being a public transit first city and meeting our climate goals, getting less traffic and more people served is going to require a sort of full contact, full evolution solution. And I think hiring more riders is a part of that. And so you will find us championing that, championing rather the operations side to provide the kind of robust service I think we need in the city. And that, will be good for Roger and his team because they'll have more operators as part of their team. And I think it's good for us as riders in the city who want better service from our various lines. And so for us, I think that's kind of, Victor, where I find myself is having to say, no. How are you going to hire? How are you going to train? How can you do it to fill your open position backlog? And then can we get ourselves to the next level? And how do we fund that? So that's really where I think we're focused at this point from the transit rider perspective.
And I'm gonna stay on that point about, or that question you ended with, how do we fund them? I'm gonna just throw this out there for how people want to chime in, because federal aid has come in and has prevented layoffs of transit operators and employees. But how far does that aid go in solving the financial problems that last year put Muni in? Any volunteers?
I can hop in, but I'm going to save any current or future viewers from an incredibly wonky deep dive into SFMTA's financial policy and try to keep it high level. So we've been really fortunate, and I think the agency has been rightfully so really grateful to Washington, because we have gotten and will continue to get federal aid that will essentially allow us to stave off what we're going to be incredibly devastating layoffs, not just to the agency as an entity, but to the individual operators, to Roger's point, that have done so much and would have been, some of the first to be let go in order to keep the agency afloat. So for the next, call it 2 fiscal years or so, we're looking at a good operating budget position. We are going to be able to continue to maintain levels of service that we currently have, which are around 70% of pre-pandemic levels, and move that up to roughly 85% of pre-pandemic levels of service by January, which, to Mark's point, is not exactly adequate to really make San Francisco a transit first city, but it's what they're saying they're going to be able to do as of now. what we had pre-pandemic that we're still dealing with is this ballooning structural deficit, which essentially means that it is more expensive to run SFMTA. It costs more to run SFMTA than we are getting through fare box revenue, through sales tax and general fund transfers, and through some other revenue generating measures. So what the agency is hoping to do is essentially create a more sustainable source of funding moving forward. So right now, a non-trivial part of SFMTA's revenue picture on an annual basis is strictly just tickets. So when a passenger boards, what they pay to ride Muni, and parking revenue is also a non-trivial part of that. The agency is saying, hey, we want to have some consistency and we want to have some dependable income. So they're talking about putting a ballot measure on the ballot in 2022, the details of which are not yet known. But the idea is that that would help essentially provide, again, a more stable funding source for the agency that would allow us to maybe moving forward, not rely on one-time funding from federal aid, and also really start to think about how we can invest in our operators, in our service, and then also in some of the deferred maintenance and capital projects that Muni has long had to put on the back burner in order to just keep things moving.
Did anyone else have any thoughts to chime in with?
I guess I'll add a little more, and I'm about to show my age here, so I just want to acknowledge that. But I'm a nearly lifetime resident, aside from a sojourn on the East Coast of California. I'm old enough to remember when Proposition 13 passed, and I went to public school the next year, and a third of my teachers were gone from the classroom. And that began a pattern of low and disinvestment in critical infrastructure across our state, whether it was removing funding from colleges and public schools or failing to properly fund needs in transportation. I remember when we switched from can we conserve energy and conserve gas to let's just use as much as we can of all of that. And so, you know, the problems that we face now as a city across our infrastructure spectrum, including transit, these seeds were sown many years ago. And unfortunately, we are now the ones who have to problem solve around how it is that we both rebuild the necessary infrastructure, but also provide the future for the city that we need coming out of a crisis like COVID. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that that is a serious and systemic issue. It's not like our city's plumbing system is working beautifully either, right? We have a lot of these infrastructure issues, and unfortunately, transportation is in part infrastructure. When you go to build transit infrastructure, you have to go through CEQA, you have to go through these long processes. It can take years to fix. And so it's very easy to back burner important things in an effort to sort of keep the system alive. And we are now getting to the place where we can't back burner things anymore. I'm excited for subway service to come back. I have no confidence that the train control system is going to see us through the summer. And that's a huge investment, actually, that has just been kind of kicked down the road for a long time. So for me, I think, you know, one of the things that we're trying to advocate with our transit riders is let's be serious about solving the real problems that we face, acknowledging that they are deep and difficult. And how do we get to a strategy that isn't just a survival strategy, but is a strategy to thrive? And that is complicated. Carly's right. It's super wonky. We haven't even talked about how federal money gets distributed, which goes through MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, who even now is discussing withholding some of that money and maybe using it for things other than service provision. And you know, there's some significant conversations about that are multi-layered, very wonky, and very complicated. But these are long-term problems that have to be solved, and they can't be solved on the back of our operators, our labor. Those are the most critical folks in providing the service we need, and they can't entirely be solved at the fare box. We cannot charge $10 a ride to ride Muni because we disinvested for the better part of 40 years. We actually need to do the hard work of solving these issues.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next question, do you want to add anything, Roger?
Just to touch up on what Mark was saying, there's not one big solution that's going to fix the muni problem. It's a plethora of smaller solutions here and there that is going to end up making and improving the system overall. You can't just throw just one stimulus package bailout plan and then expect for it to improve. It's a plethora of smaller ideas and solutions that are going to end up making big change in the overall system. So there's not just one single solution, it's a plethora of solutions.
So speaking of these solutions, in order to talk about the stakes of our infrastructure, I'd like to ask for you guys to consider, what if these solutions don't come? And what could happen if our public transit doesn't receive more support? So in this fellowship project and researching and looking into transit as the role in recovery, the term transit death spiral came up a lot, and it's one of the first industry terms that I learned. So actually, I'm going to kick this one to you, Mark, to explain what it is, but I'd also like to ask, how close do you think we are to the spiral after you tell us what that is? So Mark, I'm going to give that over to you.
Yeah, so thanks. The transit death spiral, such a lovely name on a lovely day. There's a couple things about transit death spirals. One is service related, right? So as a rider, if I can't depend on quality, reliable service, I find alternate methods of getting to where I need to go. So you get a ridership death spiral that can happen. The more unstable the system becomes, for whatever reasons those are, the more unreliable it becomes, the less I can depend on it to get to my job, the more I'm going to look for alternative methods of transportation. And that begins a ridership decline that can be very hard to arrest. So that's sort of one element. Another element of the death spiral, the classic transit death spiral, is you do what we've done, which is you load up a system with a lot of deferred maintenance, a lot of structural defects, a lot of old equipment. You fail in those investments. And so your system, because of those investment failures over a long period of time, becomes more and more unstable as the infrastructure is unable to support the transit, the provision of the service. And unfortunately, when you don't invest in things, they don't get cheaper, they get more expensive. You know, the dollar I spend today to buy a good is almost guaranteed to be a cheaper dollar than the dollar I will spend 10 or 20 years from now. So we have that problem. And we also have the problem that when we fail in these investments, over time, that cost gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it also sort of accrues interest, if you will. So what we're facing, you know, there's a state of good repair number, which is a way of talking about kind of how much deferred maintenance is in the system, how many old vehicles are in the system, how many things that we're keeping alive by incredible investment in real time. You know, the Breda cars are difficult to repair, difficult to get parts for. It causes additional costs as we have to, in some cases, even fabricate things. You know, so those costs all accumulate. So not only are you carrying the additional carrying cost of trying to get the thing to work that you have, but you're not investing in the other thing, and that number gets huge. And I want to say, you know, that the chart is that horrible hockey stick chart that by the end of it, we're looking at something like, I think SFMTA put a number up there like 32 billion by 2030 or something like that in terms of the accumulated costs. So that is the other side of the death spiral, right? It's the infrastructure, the financing death spiral. And those two things are interrelated. And there's certainly other things we could add to the table, but those are probably the simplest. And that, you know, that really does frame our discussion. I ride the end. I want my end back really badly, but I also don't want to be sitting in the tunnel because the train control system doesn't work, right? And so that is, and if I have to sit in the tunnel a lot, all of a sudden I will find other ways than taking my beloved trolley car, right? So it's actually, you know, that is kind of the classic symptomatic view of the death spiral. And I think Carly and Roger could probably add additional elements, but those are the two biggies to my mind.
Roger or Carly, would you like to chime in with that?
Well, I guess I'd say that I'm not going to echo or reiterate everything that Mark stated because it is indeed accurate. And after the death spiral, what San Francisco would look like is an extra 30,000 Ubers out there and Lyfts. It would mean a hell of a lot more pollution, congestion, traffic, etc. So one of the ways that we need to avoid that is investing in the system, having more vehicles out there. Because like I stated earlier, we have the operators. What we don't have is the vehicles because the damn things are parked in the parking garage. They've been parked there for the past 12 months. So let's bring those things out and let's put them back into service. Another possible feasible solution to avoid this transit death spiral is giving people some sort of positive hope. For example, at key strategic locations, at certain terminals, having cleaners there so that the general public can see, oh, wow, these buses are being cleaned every trip, not just at the divisions or at the, when the operators pull out the vehicle, but actually in the streets. That right there would give the riding public more of a sense of confidence, trust, faith that the buses are cleaner, safer, more sanitized, etc. And my biggest issue is bringing out these vehicles, take them out of the damn parking lots and put them back into service. It's that simple.
And I think building off of the picture that Roger paints of a San Francisco without a reliable, robust transit network, you also have a really big equity problem that, we've already seen emerge, and that would only be exacerbated, which is that those 30,000 Ubers or whatever it is that Roger described, most of our most vulnerable residents, most of the people who have actually been on the front lines making the city work throughout this pandemic, while so many of us have been able to work from home, they're not going to be the people that are taking Ubers. They're going to be the people who are left stranded in corners of the city without reliable or easy transit access. And so I just think it bears repeating that some of us might say, okay, so what? Like, there's already bad traffic. It gets a little worse. Or like, oh, the pollution's never going to be that bad, right? Like, I hear these things sometimes amongst a certain type of San Francisco resident, where to them, it doesn't translate into this real life concern. To them, these conversations around transit first are a little bit more abstract. There are thousands of people in San Francisco whose lives would be immeasurably changed and in many ways compromised without transit. They would not be able to get to work. That would limit their job opportunity. They could not get to good grocery stores. They could not get their kids to school. They could not go seek healthcare. It's already hard enough to live in this city if you don't have a tremendous amount of means. And so I just think it's important to consider the fact that transit really is an equity element at play here as well. And so, for that reason as well, it's worth investing in the system and thinking about how we can make it not just viable, but truly a fantastic state-of-the-art system moving forward.
So who can help? Like, what agencies or groups have the means or maybe the oversight to make a difference? And is there anything the general public can do? We'd like to take a crack. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. So look, I actually think, and our organization is premised on the idea that amongst the most significant and impactful players in the system are the people of the city and county of San Francisco. Whether you're riding transit or you wish you could ride transit, you are our most impactful thing. Reach out to your board of supervisor member and ask, not the sort of what are you doing to get this back, but what are you doing to protect our system for the long term? How can we deal with that? What serious steps are we going to push our legislators to vote for? My organization advocated for federal relief money. We brought the riders' voices along with our national coalition partners to key senators, key legislators, people who aren't even pro-transit. When they heard from riders and people who had been denied transit during COVID, all of a sudden it got a whole lot easier for us to make progress on getting real money into those relief bills, which was not something that was a give me. It was a hard fought fight. And we're now beginning that fight at the federal level to see permanent federal support for public transportation systems across the country. Again, that rider voice, a critical piece. So if you are a person in this city who's sitting in traffic and miserable about it, public transit can be a solution, and we need your help to get there. If you are a transit rider, you don't have to join our organization. We're doing advocacy all the time, trying to get for better, more reliable transit, but it really is a will of the people problem first. Holding our decision makers accountable, seeing to it that these systems and processes are being done correctly, asking for more resources to be put to this critical service. And I would just expand on what Carly said in terms of the equity. Not only do we have the inequity of losing the system, it was actually never really built for equity, and we have to redress that. And that takes investment as well. That means in D10, D9, D11, parts of D6, we actually do commit ourselves to fundamentally changing that transit landscape so those folks can escape the burden of car ownership for the much better, more affordable public transportation system that they need. And that really is best solved by people advocating for what they need. So that's where I would put it. And that's where you get accountability from mayor and supervisors and the board of SFMTA. You begin to be able to put pressure. And I think Muni management does listen to the public. You see them deploying service right now to places that have been neglected because of that key public pressure from people who need that service back. That is the winning solution in this city, in my view. And admittedly, I am a transit advocate and people are our bread and butter. But I really do think, Victor, you need to reach out to your supervisor. You need to reach out and align yourself with your community members who want to get better transit, and it'll happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think even for folks who might be intimidated around the idea or feel like they don't have time to get involved in advocacy, though, again, it's not super hard. You can always kind of figure out a way, whether it's just a quick little email to a supervisor or to an SFMTA board member or to the email that they have for public comment. And I think we can definitely provide some of those resources, maybe through you, Victor, at the end of this panel, so folks can know where to look should they want to. But even for folks who don't want to do that or who don't feel like they can, just riding transit, because it's really difficult for lawmakers and policymakers to ignore what is clearly an asset. And I think the more people that are on transit and the more that people return to transit, the more that asset becomes undeniable. And, it's hard to make a case to invest in a system, whether that's politically or financially and pragmatically, if it doesn't seem like people are using it. And right, there's this death spiral conversation, which is, okay, maybe people aren't using it because it's not providing easy or reliable service. And that is definitely part of the complicating factor here. However, for those who can, even if it's 10 minutes longer or a 3-block walk, try taking transit these days rather than hopping in an Uber or hopping in a car, just to show that there is that investment and there is that public and political will to invest in the system. And over time, to Mark's point, that will make a difference, and that those ridership numbers will grow. And also you'll ride transit and realize that it's actually this great resource. If you haven't been riding it a lot, you'll realize that it can be really wonderful, and you'll probably feel compelled to keep riding.
And before I move on to the final question, do you want to add anything to that, Roger?
Excuse me, I want to agree with everything that Mark and Carly stated, and the general public is probably the driving force and the driving factor in terms of making any sort of political change, transit equity change, etc. So if you think of something as simple as, let's say, getting on the 14 Mission, on 22 Fillmore, 38 Gary, and the bus is packed, if it's overcrowded, guess what? Encourage those passengers to get on the phone, call 311 and say, hey, I'm on bus number 1111 going up Gary Street, and I want you to know that the damn bus is packed. We need more service out here. Imagine if you got every single person on that bus, all of the 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever passengers on that bus to call in at that time. or even just on a daily basis, whatever line that you ride, if there's not enough social distancing, you don't have 6 feet from one passenger to the next. Imagine what that would do to the system. They would have to pay attention. So as a result, I agree fully with Carly and Mark in terms of the driving force and the driving factor of making change is indeed the general public. But they have to take action, whether it's with a phone call, writing an email, or whatever the case may be. So please take that word of consideration and turn it into action.
Okay, and I'll take this moment to remind anyone who's watching that you can submit questions for the Q&A section that we're coming up on. This will be my final question of the panelists. So if you have a question that you'd like to address to any of these 3 panelists we have, now's the time to write it down. But my final question for the panelists today is one that looks to the future. It's always been advised that you should try to turn every disaster into an opportunity. So considering last year was arguably a disaster for a lot of reasons, what opportunities does it present to transit right now? I'll kick this one to you, Roger.
I guess I'd have to say trying new things, coming up with new ideas, different solutions, as opposed to doing the same old things that we were doing back in the days. Like I stated, one of those things might be strategically placing transit bus cleaners at certain terminals to show the general public that our buses are cleaner, they are safer, they are more sanitized, whatever the case may be. And like I said, that's just one solution out there. So I would say doing things in a new manner, doing things differently, and coming out of this norm of not knowing and understanding how to do things, and trying new things, new solutions.
Carly, your thoughts on this?
Sure. So I completely agree. And I think building on that, I think trying new solutions quickly. So city agencies, typically do not move in a speedy fashion. And I think that the pandemic, whether it's transit specifically for the SFMTA or streets more broadly, things like temporary transit lanes, HOV lanes on the SFMTA board agenda later today, it's forced the agency to try new things without a tremendous amount of angst over what that might look like or what consequences it could have, or getting caught up in bureaucracy. And there's a happy medium. I'm not suggesting that acting in an emergency state of mind is the solution for everything for forever. But I do think that it has demonstrated that, like, we can learn, we can have some really important takeaways if we just try something, and then we engage the public around that experiment and we see how it's actually working in the flesh, in the field. So I think that's one. And then 2, and I should really give Roger credit for this because he and I have had a couple conversations around this. I think that, we share a hope that coming out of this pandemic, one of the major learnings will be an appreciation for the operators and for the people that really keep SFMTA moving. It has been a really difficult time for them. And not just because they're faced with sort of the trauma of potentially contracting COVID while on the job for over a year, but also because people have been pretty awful at an increased rate over the last year. And it was hard enough before the pandemic. So, I personally just hold out hope that at the end of this, we're going to recognize that our muni operators, that, like, the bus driver that we see in 2 years when we're going back downtown and things feel quote unquote normal, I hope that we remember that he or she, or they were there to really keep the city moving forward, and that without them, there is no San Francisco that moves in the way that we hope to see it move moving forward.
I guess it's my turn. Victor, I have great appreciation for what both Carly and Roger said. I in my previous work before coming to Transit Riders, one of the things I did was disaster response. So after disasters, I was one of the folks that showed up right after the folks with badges. I think sometimes we can be a little too glib about disaster as opportunity to come back better. And I want to ground us in people's experience. I was on the ground in Haiti 10 days after the earthquake in 2010. There's no talk in that environment about, oh, how can we build back better? It was, how do we survive this? And I just want to acknowledge that some folks in our community, some of our transit operators even, are still in very much a mode of survival, and moving too quickly from, can we just see this through, to, okay, how can we make everything the way we want it, sometimes cannot allow people to actually really deal with the impact of what has happened. And I think it's critical that as a city, we actually do a decent job of acknowledging the depth of some of the struggles that are out there, because I think that really is the path to energizing and leveraging people's best creative solutions, best adaptive solutions to what we face. And so it really is that rich sort of, okay, what has this meant for us? What has this revealed about our city that we either were trying not to notice or can't avoid seeing now? And how can we really build to make our weaknesses not so weak anymore? How can we better connect our distressed neighborhoods? We can go through a long list there, but I really do think it starts with a little more careful listening to one another, and sometimes a little bit less trying to provide solutions for things. And I am trying to, unlearn a lifetime of mansplaining. So that's where I'll leave it at, and hope that we can kind of work together to adapt to a new future.
Thank you. And that was my final question before I get into the Q&A. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists for being here and taking time out of your busy schedules. But I do want to get to one question that was submitted. So Haya asks, where in the US or anywhere else have there been successes in turning problematic transportation systems around? Anyone like to take a crack at that one?
I'm not sure where, but I would like to say that it could and should start here in the city and county of San Francisco. There's no reason why we can't.
Was there anyone else like to take a crack at that, or pass?
I guess I'll just say, Victor, some of the places that are touted as having responded really well to this have a different transit culture than we do. And I think it's too easy to discount that, actually, because of their pro-transit culture, because some of the systems that get lifted up are in places where people during flu season wore masks before all this, rather than thinking that wearing a mask for the safety of your community is an infringement upon your freedom, right? They're just such different milieus and such transit cultures. I hesitate to lift them up, except I do want to wholeheartedly jump on what Roger said, which is San Francisco occupies this unique place in people's imaginations. And if we can do this right, we really can change our culture around some important and critical issues, not just in the state and in our nation, but as kind of an exemplar to the world. And I'd like us to seize the challenge that Roger is sort of pointing to, because I think we're up for it and we're up to it. We just need to really focus on that as the way forward.
And one last question that someone had written in who can't be here today. They were wondering about all this talk about the exodus of San Francisco, that the San Francisco population has dropped a little since last year. Is that going to have an impact on public transit, just having a smaller city?
So I can hop in first. I mean, I think we don't know what we don't know. However, I have done a decent amount of digging into this question, essentially around like what the future of San Francisco looks like from an urban planning and transit perspective. And I mean, pretty much everyone you talk to, and the data suggests also that San Francisco is pretty resilient. It's not as though San Francisco has looked the same for its entirety of existence, right? I mean, like, nor has any major city in the country, nor has really any place for that matter, right? So like, yes, San Francisco is changing, and maybe this expedited a certain transition that would have happened down the line. But I think that people are very optimistic that San Francisco is always going to be an attractive place to live. I think there's been kind of this like national media narrative that's been a little bit fear mongering around like the death of San Francisco, and it's this place that's just been hollowed out, and you know, everything you see is dark and scary. And I mean, that could not, that's just not really what we're seeing in terms of the way that we're planning for the future, the way that we're seeing travel patterns. Yes, San Francisco has been hit harder than, you know, some other peer major cities when we look at like tourism spending and sales tax revenue. A lot of that though is likely due to the fact that we've taken COVID very seriously in terms of our restrictions. And frankly, to Mark's point earlier about understanding how hard this has been for the community, thank goodness we have in many ways, because we have had, you know, more, I don't want to say success, but a less ravaging COVID experience on the whole than, again, many of our major peer cities. So we don't know what we don't know. I'm not in the business of making predictions. What I am told is that the city plans for a robust future for the city as a whole, but also its transit system. It is not scared off by the long-term idea of there being a smaller city in San Francisco. You know, so I think that that's a legitimate concern based on what we're reading about the city that we live in, but it's not necessarily being reflected in the patterns that we're seeing. And also just something to note is like a lot of people are moving to the Bay. So like, it's not as though people are leaving the Bay Area in general. People might be leaving San Francisco proper and moving to areas where they can get more space. The North Bay or the East Bay or the South Bay, but many folks are still staying in the region, and there's always going to be that reason for them to be using BART, to be using Uni, to be spending money in our various commercial corridors. So I just think it's important to kind of read into some of the nuance and read between the lines of some of the headlines that we're seeing nationally when thinking about that question.
Thank you. And if no one else has anything to add, I think we can leave it there. Thank you guys again for being here. I really appreciate it. I know the three of you have a lot of work on your plate constantly, especially now more than ever. So taking an hour out of your week to come be here means a lot to me, and I'm sure all of our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.